everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Candida Rifkind. I'm a professor in the English department, and working the camera tonight is Professor Brandon Christopher, chair of the Department of English. And we are the co-organizers of One Book UW, and we're just thrilled to welcome you to our panel discussion tonight, titled Redrawing the Past, Reimagining the Future, Indigenous Comics Today. Tonight's panel is sponsored by the H. Sanford Riley Fellowship in Canadian History, and we're very grateful to the Department of History for supporting One Book UW through this grant. Before we introduce our speakers, we would like to take this opportunity, Brandon and I, as settler scholars who work in the Department of English, to think about the land we are on. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we live and work in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations. The University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of Anishinaabe peoples. Treaty 1, signed in 1871, took this territory from 7 local Anishinaabe First Nations in order to make the land available for settler use and ownership. The language and academic discipline of English are complicit in Canada's and Manitoba's colonial history and ongoing treatment of Indigenous territories and peoples. Today, we witness the continuing legacy of this history in a multitude of injustices, inequities, and violences that threaten the health, well-being, and safety of Indigenous peoples throughout our province, particularly women and youth. We acknowledge English's complicity. We also recognize the diverse ways that artists and thinkers from Indigenous communities are reclaiming and revitalizing English to produce vibrant, expressive literatures and cultures. Studying oral, written, and visual representations of and by Indigenous peoples allows us to confront the colonial and imperial histories of our discipline and to engage with the full range of Englishes that energize our research and teaching. The work of those of us who study and teach in these areas is strengthened by a centering of Indigenous and allied perspectives that helps us to challenge power structures, inequality, stereotypes, and racism. Part of our motivation for organizing this One Book project around this place, 150 years retold, is to extend our commitment to this work beyond our classrooms, into the broader university community and beyond, and to generate discussions that cross disciplines and approaches to the process of indigenization and the politics of reconciliation. So we thank our panelists and all of you for coming here tonight to engage in this work. I'd now like to introduce the moderator for this evening's panel, Dr. Julie Pelletier, who will then introduce each of the speakers before they give a brief presentation, and then we'll open it up for a conversation amongst the panelists and for questions from the audience. So Dr. Julie Pelletier is with the Department of Anthropology at UW. Her research and advocacy include indigenization and decolonization of the Academy, Indigenous representation, Indigenous critiques of the Anthropocene, and American Indian casinos as sites of economic, one moment please.
Economic.
Sovereignty, yeah.
I was going to say economic, we're waiting for it. Exploitation, no. Sorry.
Oh, Julie, I lost the page. You have my page. Yeah? Yeah, I gave it to Julie herself. Okay, so Indian casinos as sites of economic sovereignty. As a longtime fan and teacher of comics and graphic novels, Julie embraced the One Book UW project, assigning this place in her courses, and she's been really invaluable as a source of support and energy for us. So we're really happy she agreed to moderate tonight.
It's not your leader.
See, if I had actually printed my own document, this wouldn't have happened. We're gonna say it was for environmental reasons. Dungag Glogil, Lewis, Julie Pelletier, Najeo Willistook, Maliseet Nigma. I'm Julie Pelletier. I'm from the East Coast. Originally, I've been here for about 9 years, and I acknowledge my my place in this space as a guest. We are sharing because, you know, that's what we do. We're sharing a microphone. So our first panelist, I'll introduce them before they speak one by one. So Jen Storm's going to start us off. She's the One Book UW writer in residence. And she is an Ojibwe writer from the Couchiching First Nation in northwestern Ontario. Born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Jen completed Deadly Loyalties, her first novel, at the age of 14. Firestarters was her first graphic novel. She's a contributing author to This Place, 150 Years Retold, and the upcoming graphic novel anthology, Moonshot, Volume 3. Currently, she's working on another graphic novel and is an acquisitions editor for a new Indigenous graphic novel series with Highwater Press. Jen was a 2017 recipient of the CBC Manitoba's Future 40 over 40.
Under 40.
No, you got it right the first time. You got it right. You got it right.
I thought that sounded strange. Anyway, with that awkward moment, here you go.
Okay, so hi, my name is Jen Storm, and I'm from Couchiching First Nation. I am going through these questions because I didn't read the full email when I got it, so I needed to get these printed out. And I want to start by talking about the story I wrote for This Place, which is a story about Wendigos. And I really wanted to do that story, and it takes part in northern Manitoba, where in 1907, a man named Jack Fiddler was there, and he was one of the leaders of this community that I can't remember the name of all of a sudden. And it was kind of a story that started off by talking about justice and talking about how Canada came in as a government to a community that wasn't following Canadian justice, that they were their own isolated community. And they had their own rules, their own way of living, their own justice system, their own government, all these things. And how when Canada came and kind of implemented their own things and interrupted that way of life, that really kind of uprooted the community and broke things apart. But I really wanted to write this story in a different perspective, which was that of one, the Wendigo, and two, from a female perspective, which is always missing from history, I find. So while I was doing research for this story, I spoke with the person who wrote the original book, which was called it's by James Stevenson.
Yeah, the shaman.
Killing the Shaman.
Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank God you're here. And in that book, he speaks of it from the male perspective, and I was looking through this book, and it's a fascinating book that I recommend everyone to read. But there was zero mention of the women's experience and how the women in the community were responding to this, how they thought about this, if they were interviewed or any of these things, or essentially even the Wendigos that were being killed. And so I asked him, I emailed him, and he said, the one regret I have about that book is that I didn't talk to the women. And so I did some work, and I tried to communicate with people from that community, but then it just kind of came down to an imagining what it would be like to be in that community. And also just from the perspective of a Wendigo, obviously that is a full imagination component of it. And my own interpretation of Wendigos as well, because there is a varied amount of research out there, which I've done just in my own for fun because I just love Wendigos. I love Wendigo stories. I love pretty much every interpretation there is of them. And I really wanted to speak on it from the perspective of Wendigos as cannibals in a time when people were starving much of the time. And even like a little piece of insanity as well. So those are probably my favorite parts about writing it and the research involved. And there's like a lot of little pieces in the artwork as well that were kind of put in there that are specific to Wendigo stories traditionally. And as far as the collaboration involved in writing graphic novels, I think when you first, as a writer, it's a very isolating experience. You're just by yourself, your own imagination, your own little world, and you're writing things out like a script, which is a lot different than the traditional literary form of writing. You don't have to do as much literary work. I'm just basically feel like I'm writing, or I'm like directing a play, so to speak, so that when artists get to it, they're reading it and they kind of can picture how the image should look. And I'm going to let you talk more about that process. I'm not going to talk too much about it. But what I really enjoyed about it was the fact that I can imagine something and I can think I'm being really distinct about how I want to see something. And I'll even show pictures and like references or however like clear I want to be. and we can have back and forth about that. But the really cool part is that when you write out a story and you see it a certain way, when you pass it off to an artist and then you get to read that art and those words again, you get to see it almost like in a totally different experience, because no one's going to experience it the same way that you do or that you write it. So in my experience, that's probably the funnest part about doing comics, is the collaborative process. Sorry. And as for like this book and how I see it kind of fitting Indigenous history today, I think it's really important to have our perspective shared and in the classroom and in a way that's accessible to everyone and fun for everyone to read. I haven't really heard of many people struggling with comics, but I've heard recently, actually while I've been here as a writer-in-residence, that there is some people that struggle with reading graphic novels and kind of putting the imagery, absorbing the imagery while also absorbing the story can be difficult. But I guess myself, as somebody who is a storyteller and artist, I just kind of love it. I love that you can absorb so much from a story, and you can tell so much of a story just by using imagery and not just words. Yeah, I think I answered everything. Who's second?
Good job.
We had, the organizers had sent out just questions to the panelists to think about and to try to shape some of their thoughts. So it's certainly nothing rigid or anything like that. The next person who will be speaking is Scott B. Henderson. Scott is author, illustrator of the sci-fi fantasy comic, The Chronicles of Era, and has illustrated select titles in the Canadian Air Force's For Valor series, Tales from Big Spirit series, the graphic novel series 7 Generations, Betty, the Helen Betty Osborne story, select stories in This Place, 150 Years Retold, and Eisner Award nominee, A Blanket of Butterflies. So please join me in welcoming Scott.
Hello, good evening, welcome. Hi, my name is Scott B. Henderson, and I'm the illustrator specifically for This Place for the stories written by Katarina Vermette, the Anabantine Annie of the River, and Richard Van Camp's story Like a Razor Slash, as well as I was the letterer for the entire anthology book series, or the entire anthology. As a non-Indigenous person, I'm going to leave much of the discussion about the importance of comic books and Indigenous history and that to Jen, Chelsea, and Alice. It's not really my place, so what I'm going to be focusing on is more my area of expertise, which is the illustrations, and my skill set at being able to help to visualize the stories of these writers, these Indigenous writers who are trying to tell a story and carve out their little space, and for me to use my skills to help amplify that to get to a new or different audience that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, things like that. There's probably going to be a lot of really awkward pauses like this. So I've been working with a lot of Indigenous writers for the last 10 years or so, starting with David Robertson, largely through the publisher Highwater Press. And so in those years I've been getting a lot of practice at working and collaborating. And so as a non-Indigenous person, there kind of is an extra emphasis on me to be as thorough as I can be in my research. There are many pitfalls from inaccurate information from books or online and things like that. Limited reference, like working on stories that maybe don't have a lot of photographic references, or they're based on paintings which were maybe done by the colonizers and settlers and that sort of thing. So once again, from a skewed perspective perhaps. Or even dealing with any personal biases that I may have that I haven't identified yet. And so I've had a lot of practice working with David. I think I've had a lot of success, and despite all the pitfalls, there's always that chance that I could make a mistake, but I ultimately have to I must trust and ultimately defer to the research of the authors, as well as the editors and the historians and the experts that are vetting the stories and things like that, so that they can catch anything that maybe I just by chance got wrong, and help with little details and add to those corrections. So as Jen mentioned, there's a huge collaborative process with graphic novels. With a lot of comic books and graphic novels, everything is sort of compartmentalized. Part of that's to be able to produce a book in a reasonable amount of time. Like, there are people that do literally everything, but it can maybe take them months or even years to get it done. Whereas we're trying to get sometimes something like this done in a matter of months. So you have a writer, but then you'll have an artist. Sometimes there's multiple artists. Sometimes there's a penciler and an inker, and then of course there's the colorist, and then there's the letterer, and then there's the editor, and all these sorts of people. So that's all the people that are put together for one book or one issue. In the case of this place, you have to take that and then you have to times it by 10. So it was quite a collaboration through different art styles, different writing styles, different time periods and everything. Whenever I collaborate with a writer, the process is pretty much the same each time. There's just some little bit of differences. So first things I get is I'll get a copy of the story and I go through it. I start to build on the research. I start doing things like thumbnails, starting to plan out how I'm going to write down this story. This can be different for different writers. Some writers have a much more open-ended sort of script, a little bit more open. They leave a lot more imagination, or rely a little bit more on, say, the artist, me, or whoever, to come out with the layout or the pace of the story and the pages and things like that. Other authors, such as David Robertson, are much more thorough and much more specific in their storytelling. And that while he's not artistically inclined at all, he can do a really good Dora. I know that much. He can do Dora the Explorer, no problem. But while not artistically inclined, he does have a very strong visual sense, because he does write and imagine the stories in almost a cinematic kind of way. And he uses a lot of that same language that's in cinema and films and that sort of thing. They cross over very nicely with comic books and page layouts. And so in that way, you can really visualize things. I've come to, over the years, actually quite appreciate that sort of style of storytelling. I like being open-ended and being able to come up with my own pace. But in the case with working with David, it's also very easy because he and I actually think a lot alike, so it's not like there's a really strong conflict. It's like he writes it and goes, that's exactly how I would imagine it. So it sort of cuts to the chase a little bit faster. I don't have to work quite as much at coming up with the layouts. So yeah, so in case of this, I just have up on the screen here just a sample from Katerina Vermet's story. So she, like many of the writers I've worked with, have a much more open story. So in this case, I took from page 18, which I'll be showing the art for in a little bit. It's pretty open. And they said it's page 18, and she's just more or less listing what's going to happen on this page, but there's no breakdown of how many panels, the pace, or anything like that. Just generally what's happening. If there's any narration or speaking or sound effects, things like that. If David was writing this, it would be page 18, panel 1, wide, or 1/3 of the page showing this, that, or that, and then somebody speaking. And panel 2 is going to be the remaining 2/3 of the line, and then the next line is going to be a full line, zoom in, zoom out, all that sort of stuff. Here, I can do whatever I want. So next, especially for this place, which probably had the heaviest amount of research and vetting that I've ever had on any of the projects with Tidewater. And I mean, they do a lot of historical books and that, but this one, there was just an extra emphasis on all that to be really thorough and accurate, which I think is great. So with Annie, I started doing some conceptual sketches, just trying to get an idea of who the characters were, how to draw them, how to make Luriel look like Luriel and not mess it up. I got a little bit of practice just through with some of Katarina's other books, The Girl Called Echo, which deals with the Métis again, and Foundation of Manitoba and Métis history. So I'll do some sketches, or that's when I also start breaking down the pages into thumbnails, which are just little sketches. This is a 8.5 by 11 page, and I just usually do 3 lines, sort of sketches. It looks pretty detailed, but to me it's not that detailed. Mostly it's just a rough sketch, getting a sense of the number of panels, the layout, the flow of the story. I think in this one, the second line there actually is the left page there is actually the excerpt that I had from Katarina's script there. So I imagined it as Annie coming out, yelling out Mayor's name, and she's got her bullwhip there in hand, and then that's the big, I figured that's going to be the big picture. That's the one that's going to have all the emphasis that I want on it. Next, it's her pinching his nose, and then dragging him out of the shot. How was the script of that? Yeah, well, actually, I guess that was only the first line, apparently. She arrives in the store, she yells out his name, and Mary's surprised, everyone makes way, she pulls him by the nose and heads outside. So, I guess page 18 got split up into 2 pages, I guess, at some point. Yeah, so I'm just trying to figure out layout. Sometimes I'm trying to figure out where lettering will go, things like that. Each step of the way with a collaboration like this, I'm constantly sending thumbnails back and sketches back to the writer and the editor and things like that to get it approved, make sure everything's okay and with how they want to tell the story, especially if I make little changes like expanding the story here and there. And so once it's approved, that's when I start going into drawing the pages. I draw very traditionally. I still use pencil, pen, and on paper. I work on 11 by 17 pages, which then get shrunk down. Once again, with the heavy vetting for this project, I worked on the pencils. I send off the pencils to get them approved if there's going to be any changes. For example, the big mansion-looking thing in panel 2 there off to the left. Apparently that was their house later on. Apparently they had a slightly more modest house before this, so I had to change that. But yeah, it gets approved. I'm pretty thorough with my pencils, laying everything out, so it's pretty clear and easy for the historians and the writer to know what I'm drawing and what to correct. It gets approved, and I move pencils for this page. So Annie's already dragged Mare out into the streets, and she's giving him a good flogging for disrespecting the women of the Red River settlement. And then once that gets approved, then I go into inking it. I personally ink directly over top my pencils, so pencils don't exist anymore. Now they're just the inks. I do some work on the computer, do some minor editing, things like that, especially if I have crooked eyeballs, which is still a problem after all these years. Oh, the house is a little bit smaller than it was there now. I grabbed a totally different page that I meant to. So that gets approved, then I send it on. In the case of this place and a lot of the stories that I've worked on, to get color, to get sent on to the colorist, in this case Donovan Yashik, who's worked with me since actually Firestarter, so Jen's first graphic novel. So he'll color the pages. I'll usually start prepping the pages to be lettering. So while I'm waiting for the coloring, I'll get the lettering done, and I do that on the computer because my handwriting is awful. And then once I get the final colors, I merge it all together and it gets sent off to the printer as well, once it gets finally approved and there's not any more mistakes or changes to be made. And that's where I'm going to stop because I don't know where else to go.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
When you get to the pencil part, and let's say somebody says, for example, you drew the house too big, but you did the pencils, are you erasing it like with an eraser and redrawing it in a pencil, or do you just edit that when you're doing the inking part on the computer?
I think it depends. In this case, I think I completely erased the house. There's actually a scene that I did in the graphic novel I'm working on right now, David Robertson, where it's just a close-up of hands going in to open a door to an apartment, but I mislaid out, like the hands are too far to the right now because I changed how the door handles were, so I pushed everything off to the right, but I had already put in all the perspective and all the details. It's like, I'm just going to ink this and I'm just going to edit it later because I don't want to redraw the whole panel because that just seems way more work than me just drawing the rest of the page, going outside the panel in this case, and then just going into the computer and moving and jimmying things around. So it sort of depends on the complexity and what's done. And I can still change and edit things even with the inking, or after I've inked it. Sometimes in that case, I'll just draw what needs to be changed on a separate page, and then I'll just copy, paste, and erase and blend things in that way. So I like to catch it in the penciling because it is easier, but it's not that hard, I guess. I shouldn't say that because then people will start asking me to make more changes later on. I don't want to do that. It's hard. I mean, as the letterer was also very, the color, that's part of the collaboration process. Is it's very, or it can be very challenging because there's a schedule. So everybody at the beginning gets lots of extra time. If they're running a little bit behind, it's like, oh, it's okay. You got some time. So if the writer's a little bit late, it's like, okay, it's okay. And the artist will pick it up. It's like, okay, well, I'm running a little bit behind because whatever, something happened, I'm sick this week or whatever. Oh, so it's okay, we'll catch up, we'll get some more time. But then once you start getting into colors, they're like, yeah, this is really hard. It's like, yeah, sorry, Donovan, you don't get any extra time. And then as the letterer, where I'm literally on the very end of the whole process, it's like, yeah, you have no time. You just got to do it. It's like, okay, that's why we tried to plan things out beforehand. But okay, that's cool. Life happens.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Chelsea Vowel. Chelsea Vowel is Métis from Lac Saint Anne, Alberta, residing in Edmonton. Mother to 6 girls, she has a B.Ed and LLB, and is currently a graduate student and Cree language instructor at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Chelsea is a public intellectual, writer, and educator whose work intersects language, gender, Métis self-determination, and resurgence. Please join me in welcoming her.
Danse. That's a question. How are you doing? Danse. Chelsea Vowel nagsigason na tuksa kaiganik ni Totsen, maganibigin amaswatsuwas kaiganik kanots. And yeah, so I was like on my phone, not just on Twitter, but I was asked to define Indigenous futurisms. And so I'm doing my thesis on Métis futurisms. And I was like, well, I should be able to pull out something pithy. And then I'm like, oh my God, just find your thesis and find what you wrote about it already. I'm sure you have defined this somewhere. And I'm looking through it and I'm like, I haven't really defined it. It is super intense. Okay, so I'm going to try that first before I talk about my story. So Indigenous futurisms is a phrase that was coined by Grace Dillon, and she sort of referred a little bit back to Afrofuturisms, which is a movement. It's not just writing, right? It's not just a genre. It's an entire artistic and literary movement, social movement. And so Indigenous futurisms isn't just about the future, it's about the past, the present, and the future. And I think the way that the best way that I think I would characterize it is it's taking Indigenous worldviews, and it has to be Indigenous people doing the work. Because I've seen as this sort of rises in popularity, some non-Indigenous people's chime to take it up and being like, well, if I write Native stuff, then it's Indigenous futurisms. No, I'm just going to say no to that. So it needs to take Indigenous perspectives and present them in a wide variety of ways. And it's not all fiction, right? I think a lot of the ways that we talk about our stories, and the stories that we tell get miscategorized as fiction, as like magical realism, or, you know, we have a lot of tricksters, we have a lot of transformation is at the root of a lot of our belief systems. Those things are true, those things are real, those things are not fantasy or science fiction. And so a lot of genres struggle with where to put Indigenous thoughts and Indigenous stories. And so we said, well, we don't need you to categorize it, we're just gonna put it into this realm where we just do everything. And I think it's really important to consider that our work is always addressing our positionality as peoples who are experiencing ongoing colonialism. So it's a form of resistance. It's a form of looking at ourselves reflectively in this white supremacist settler colonial system, and thinking about ways that we can continue to thrive and exist. And we can reimagine the past. We can imagine ourselves into the future. But it's an exercise in sort of you know, sovereignty, in the sense that we are taking upon ourselves to exist into the far future. We're saying that we're not going to accept annihilation, and we're not going to be written out of the story. We're going to tell our own stories from now on. I can go on for like an hour about what Indigenous futurisms are. So like, if you're struggling to define it, you are not alone. We're sort of making it up as we go, right? It's got a purpose beyond just telling stories. For me, the futurisms work that I do is an attempt to imagine what a decolonial future could look like without having to explain how we get there. And so my story in this anthology, Kitaskinau 2350, is set in the future. And Kitaskinau is interesting because Aske is land, is the Cree word for land, but it's also the Cree word for our planet. And it's also a measurement of time. It's how long the planet takes to revolve around the sun once. So it's a year. So it means many things. So Kitaskinau is our land, our planet. And it's also, Cree is interesting because we can be exclusive. We can say Nianan, me but not you, like us but not you. But we can also say Kianau, which is all of us. So even though it's in Cree, it's talking about, obviously it's all of our planet in the year 2350. And so I imagine that we live in 2350 in a completely decolonized world. And what would that look like? You know, so I had to sit down and think about what would I want? What's like, what would that be like? You know, I want to have solved the oppressions of today. I want, you know, trans and two-spirit and non-gender conforming people to be integrated into every aspect of our society. We always talk about how, you know, LGBTQ two-spirit people are super important and we need to center them, but we don't do enough of the actual work to make that happen. Folks are still excluded from ceremony, from community, still experiencing the highest rates of marginalization of all Indigenous peoples. And so I want that to be something we're working towards by ensuring that all the work we do right now centers all folks, and particularly those who experience the most marginalizations, including those with disabilities and all of that. So in the future, we just solve that. It's a thing that we have done, because if Star Trek can do it, we can do it. You know, I want us to imagine living with technology. It was really, really cool to work with the artist Tara, because I write, like I just write words, and I have no artistic talent whatsoever. And I said, this is what I want to see, a futuristic but also traditional scene. You know, like, what is that? That's pretty vague. But then she created this amazing like landscape of all these like really cool buildings. There's still a city. In the first panel, there's this really futuristic looking city. And the idea that cities can be sustainable, that they can exist in harmony with the land and not destroy the land, is something I really want to think about. And then in the foreground are some like, you know, I'm a big fan of Buckminster Fuller, so there's like some Bucky structures, some geodesic domes, and some teepees, which 2.5 years of doing edits and looking over this stuff, it was not until it was published that I realized that all of the entrances were not facing east. And I was just like, what? So yeah, it doesn't matter how many eyeballs pass this, you miss things. There are things that I notice, I will never tell you other ones, that I'm like, oh, that's a mistake, and probably nobody will notice, so it's great. So in the story, there is this character, she's 15 years old, her name is Wabanatsagos, which is the name of my youngest daughter. And she is asked to go back in time to experience the 21st century and bring some knowledge back, because what's happening is that a bunch of settlers in the 21st century decided that everything was going to shit, so they were going to go to Mars and leave the Earth behind, you know? And like, this is very Elon Musk of them. So they go, things are not great. They bring all of their oppressive systems and their hierarchies and their crappiness to Mars, and it's not a good time. Surprise, surprise. So they, after a couple hundred years, decide that this sucks and they come back to Earth, but they are stuck in 21st century ways and they don't know how to live in a decolonized world. So Wabanatskos has to go back to, you know, you can't, you know how they say, like, you can't be decolonized if you have a colonized mind. Like, how can you use your colonized mind to be decolonized? I like to think of it as going the other way too. If you live in a decolonized world, I don't want to just say future, but if you were a decolonized person, how can you understand colonialism? So she has to go back and experience this. And the technology, I was very excited about this. So I was like, what would like a Korean Métis like time machine look like? And I thought about, like, I was like, what do we use to communicate across space and time? And I was like, the shaking tent. So I was like, I think that we would design our time machine to look like a shaking tent. And not long after we had already started working on this, I went to an exhibit, I think it was in Montreal, where some Cree artists had put together this shaking tent exhibit, where it was open on one side and you could go in and you heard all these sounds, and everything was described in Cree. Like, there was no English description. If you didn't know what it was, you didn't know what it was. That's also like Indigenous futurism, because it's by us for us and not necessarily being translated. And it was just this like amazing futuristic like visual and soundscape, and I was like, other people are thinking this too. I tapped into something that other people were doing at the same time, and it was just this kind of like moment. It was very cool. Anyway, yeah, and she saves the world, and it's great. Can you ask me well?
Sorry, I'm still taking that in. I taught that chapter, and my students were, just blown away. I of course, was more blown away by them than they were, because I was like, oh my gosh, it's a shaking tent. What? I'm like, we don't know what that is. All right, guess I'll teach. We're so lucky to be joined this evening by Alice R.L., who's our respondent, and Alice R.L. is a professional illustrator and art teacher based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The non-binary transgender Ojibwe artist draws inspiration from their experiences and cultural teachings and melds it into a signature palette of bright and playful hues to create stunning juxtapositions of human brutality and emotion with hope and whimsy. Alice's range of projects include game and comic book art, digital and traditional illustration, and graphic design. Alice is a graduate of the University of Manitoba Fine Arts Program and digital media design at Red River College, so please join me in welcoming them to the panel.
Hello. Well, primarily I did my homework because I love homework. And I wrote down, what my questions were and my answers to them. Basically I'll just go over I did do the illustrator, I did the How Comics Work comic, if you, grabbed it, I didn't do it, I drew it, I didn't write any of it, because I don't enjoy doing that at all. I primarily work digitally, and obviously this book is primarily, I believe, digital. And just as an Indigenous creator, I was asked what was my experience and reading this. And so basically, for me, I was the first thing that I had when I was going to read this book was trepidation. And basically I checked the back first because I wanted to see the ratio of Indigenous to non-Indigenous people. And I was honestly kind of disappointed with that ratio. And that's just something, like, I'm a person who's pretty darn selective about the media that I choose, and I consume a lot of media. And regardless of, like, and even if I have to consume something that maybe I disagree with on some points, you know, I can still enjoy it. For the most part, I was pretty okay with the content. The three, like, I'm gonna do this in a fun compliment sandwich kind of way. The three that stood out were, so Nimki was probably the best, and in terms of story and art cohesion. This was the only one in this, like, it made me cry, because I thought it was honestly the most well done. It was a really, like, it makes for a really incredibly strong story when both the art and the story itself flow well together. And so, as compliment sandwiches go, Rosie was probably the worst. It was confusing with the images that are paired with the writing, was almost impossible, like, to read. Rosie is supposed to be, I think, a young Inuit girl, and she looks like a weird combination of Emily Strange and Betty Page, which feels like oddly sexualized for, like, however old she's supposed to be. I basically showed that one to a lot of people just to be like, am I over exaggerating this, or am I just like, can I just not understand this? I'm not the only one, thankfully. And that's just, like, I honestly don't think it's a problem with the story. I think it's a problem with the illustrations hardcore. I can definitely talk about things I don't like forever. And that was kind of, that one was probably the only one that I really disliked out of everything. And to finish my sandwich, Peggy was really well done. In terms of cohesion, art, and the story, they add to each other and they don't take away, like how Rosie did. Those were those two were my favorites. And basically the other question, because once again, love answering exactly how it's written. As an emerging Indigenous cartoonist, what opportunities and challenges do you see ahead? So, I personally have noticed more of a focus on Indigenous peoples in sort of, say, news, media, which is both a benefit and a burden. Visibility is good, but hypervisibility can be really bad. Challenge I see, like, as always, is racism, even in terms of microaggressions. So, like, for example, non-Indigenous people should be readily willing to pass on projects like this. And this will be a challenge for people, because obviously there's work, but consider the fact that Indigenous people are often passed up for non-Indigenous products or projects all the time. So it's pretty simple. Those are my challenges. Opportunities are that there is more visibility, but yes, that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. We had some follow-up questions that are meant for general discussion, and I'm just throwing them out there. One of them is about the potential challenges or limits that come with using comments as a way to tell Indigenous history. And the other one was where are we lacking? What other stories, what other areas of Indigenous history or contemporary life would you like to see addressed in comics? And so these questions are going to the entire panel. including our respondent. And so yeah, I'd like to hand the microphone to whoever would like to start with this.
I also wrote down stuff for this. I would say like the challenges or limits that come with using comics is that it can easily become whitewashed. It's super easy. There's obviously misinformation throughout history that is prevalent today. So it's pretty easy for it to happen, and once again, it continues to happen. And I would love to see more mythology, but more like horror. The last sort of media that had like the Wendigos as horror was a video game called Until Dawn, but it had literally no Indigenous people. I know. And once again, it's a pretty nifty game, but I'm just like, come on, guys, come on, man, you can throw me one, even if he dies, it's fine. Yeah, so that is about it.
Anyone else? Come on, you know you want to answer these. They're like, no, don't. They're doing that student thing where they're just staring. They're staring at the table. They're staring at the table. Yeah. See the students in the class are sitting here. You did not invent that. We've been doing it for years longer than you have, so we're pretty good at it. Or any other aspects that. One of the things that I want to ask you, Jen, was where do you feel that your Wendigo story fit into this larger book project of this 150 years of history since Confederation?
Like how it fits?
Yeah.
Well, I think largely like those stories are missing. And as Chelsea said, are very valid and real. Like, you know what I mean? So that, I think I wanted to give kind of Wendigos their space and their stage, so to speak, because usually when they're being talked about, especially by a non-Indigenous person, they're either like fairy tale kind of monsters perception, or else they're just made up things, like they're not really serving much of a purpose other than kind of like a boogeyman kind of a scenario. So I think when it comes to this book and the importance of, in my opinion, the Wendigos, is it kind of brings our history, our viewpoints, and our stories in a more valid light, and that they had their place in history, and like they kind of served their purpose, and in a time and in a history that made sense for the community that they were in, like, if that makes sense.
Certainly for me, when I taught that chapter, one of the aspects that we did focus on was the time of starvation and what was going on there, and that was. I was able then to use that as a context for the conversation, and then going on into the Wendigo aspect of it. So yeah, I appreciated that as an instructor. I had a question for you, Chelsea, about the dystopia aspect, and you comment at the beginning of your chapter that that's something you're writing against. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So one thing I constantly say, as many other Indigenous peoples do, is that we are already a post-apocalyptic people. Every sort of, potentially world-ending event that you can imagine has already happened to us, sometimes multiple times. And as Nigan was pointing out earlier, a lot of our stories as well talk about apocalyptic events that happened in generations so far back that we there's no one in living memory, but who experienced it. But so we have experienced these fractures over and over again. So we're still here. So obviously it didn't destroy us. And there's this fear, but also this like anticipation in settler culture for the apocalypse, because they think that it's gonna like create opportunities for individuals to become important. I think it's a way to think past the banality and the violence of the everyday, and believe that, if some sort of like world-altering event happened, people are going to either come together and support one another, but more often dystopic, stories talk about just the violence that will be enacted on people, and somebody, if you just start, having enough guns around, and you, buy enough canned goods and hide it in a bunker underground, you're going to be okay, and people are going to flock to you and love you. And I think that's a really destructive and terrible way to imagine our future. I think we have to consider how, if we already have experienced and are experiencing ongoing apocalypses, how can we work together to ensure the continued survival, not just of humans, our non-human kin, of the land, the earth, the water, the air, and everything that depends on Kitaskanau. So yeah, that's that on that. I also wanted to just go back to I have an answer now about some sort of issues or what did you say about blah, 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 blah. I don't know, some potential pitfalls with using comics to talk about Indigenous history or even like present. So one of the things that I always struggle with when I'm writing stories, whether it's just going to be words on a page or if it's going to be translated into a visual form like this, is what information do you give? Because we are still at a point where we're like being circled by culture vultures who want to like take and extract our knowledge and use it in really inappropriate ways. And so, there's certain things that you don't put out there because you then are responsible for what people do with that knowledge. So you have to be careful. And I think what's interesting is that we also have protocols about when you can talk about certain things. I've been wincing every time you say the W word because there's no snow on the ground. So where I'm from, we don't talk about certain creatures or certain beings until there's snow on the ground. But we also live in a world where like it's not like you can be like you can only read this in the winter. So some cool things that people do are they respect protocol in ways that allow the story to be told year round. So I'm thinking about like Dennis Goulet, for example, did a film where in the film it's snowing. So she can name certain beings. And I was like, that's brilliant, because you can watch it at any time and then not feel like you're like, eh. So those are cool things that we get to think about that, we have to grapple with. Can I tell this story? Have I consulted enough? Do I have the right to tell this story? Is this information that should be out there? And then how can I tell a cool story that people are going to get if they don't have enough cultural background? It's all this like, it's a balancing act, and it's exciting, and I think that we're going to see sort of literary conventions evolve about how to do that. Yeah, that was rambling, but it's really exciting. I think it's really interesting where people are taking it.
Certainly taking it into the classroom, that is something that I know I talk about, is seasons for telling certain stories. And I was a little bit excited when we had a bunch of snow on the ground recently. I was like, we're good. All right, we can do this. But also acknowledging that decolonizing the classroom in an essentially Western institution is what it is. It's a partial process, and it's an ongoing process. As someone who teaches this book, Scott, I was going to comment that one of the things that a lot of the instructors find frustrating is having to teach our students to read the images. When it's been assigned as even students who read comic books and graphic novels, when it is assigned in a course, they will read it like a textbook. They'll just read the words as quickly as they can, and then they'll put it down. And for an illustrator, that's obviously kind of disrespectful of your work, but what can we do to help them? I mean, I instruct them, but what can we do to really get them to understand how important the images are to carrying the story as well?
I don't know. It's hard because I have a very different perspective. I almost always read things visually and not necessarily the text. Like my favorite comics that I reread all the time, I'm not reading them very often, I love the art, so I'm learning and looking at the art and trying to understand the art, and even if it's not an art style that I want to mimic, like Mike Mignola, who I know actually mispronouncing his name apparently, but I don't want to draw like him or Dave McKean or anybody. I don't want to draw like them, but I love their art style, and there's still something that they can contribute in terms of design and how they tell a story, flow, and things like that. I don't know how to convince somebody, or I'm not convinced, but encourage somebody to read it visually. Like maybe if there was a story that didn't have any words, that would really force somebody to look at the pictures more than the words. I know with some stories, like with A Girl Called Echo, Katerina has been very sparse with a lot of words. There's pages and pages that don't have anything other than maybe a date stamp or a caption like that. I don't know, it's really weird because as an artist, I always focus more on story. And there are stories that I will reread, that I love to reread over and over again as novels and that, but they're a little bit more time consuming, so to read it, so I don't do it as often as I look through a book, even if it's like Calvin Hobbes or whatever, and the spine is falling apart because I look through it so many times. I mean, there seems to be very much more of a boom of sorts with comics and graphic novels, especially for educational purposes now, because the comics do, while these students might be having difficulties to be able to read it, it still is reaching through to people that maybe have a hard time reading. They can still capture the story, and it can sort of be a leaping point for some of that information to sort of get the more of a bite-sized morsel of information about culture or history or whatnot, and from there be able to springboard into getting into the more complex nature and to further reading in that. That looking at like this big textbook with all these thousands of words, it might put other people to sleep or be just simply a struggle or whatnot because of their reading level or ability to focus on it. Things like that. With the graphic novel, they can, with the images, with the right images anyways, and I'm not saying that I have the right images either, but that they can still get that information. I don't know, it might just, for the people that maybe are only reading the words and not looking at the pictures, that might be just something that they, I don't know, their experience wasn't to learn things through the pictures as much. I mean, visuals are so important to us that we can read stop signs and whatnot through visually, but we don't necessarily realize that we are. So maybe some people just need to be, it's like things like doing mindfulness and that. It's just training yourself to become more aware of something that is always there, it's always in the background, but you're just grown up or conditioned in a way that you just don't realize it anymore. So, I don't know. Glad that makes sense to something.
When I was writing the W story, there's little things that while I was doing research, that there was imagery even in the writing and the stories that are told, like even like through, what's the word? Like stories that were written down that are actually traditionally orally passed down. There's a lot of like cues in it. Like I noticed there's a theme in a lot of Wendigo stories that have to do with cooking. Like the big pot that's in the middle of the, like every time a Wendigo comes around, there's like a pot somewhere in there. And at the first I was like, why? Like I didn't really get it, but then like it kind of comes into like famine, like there's themes that it's kind of speaking to. And so I made sure that that was in there. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people that wouldn't have picked up on that, but I wanted my story to be authentic because I know that that's a common theme and I had to really think about it. So, and then also like even in the story, like we were talking about like how can we make it apparent, because this is a woman who is of sound mind for a while, and we have to illustrate without saying it or having text to support it, that she's becoming seduced by this Wendigo spirit. It's like, how do you imagine that? How do you see it coming? How do you see the seduction? How do you see her transform and be possessed? Like all the different things that need to happen for this change and all of that to kind of just take place. That was all related to the art only. Like there was no words for anyone to kind of skim over that. So I feel like that would probably slow somebody down if you were to ask a question like, at what point does this happen?
That was actually an interesting challenge in terms of.
Can I ask something? Or is it,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, okay, Chelsea, clarification about.
Hang on one second.
Oh, it's okay, we're not gonna talk about. You know, the TVs.
It's because we want it recorded.
We're video recording it, so we just want to make sure we get you.
I want to be famous. You have a good side with all the tea. Chelsea, this for you, a clarification on the tea piece you're talking about. And I'm in the Shinabet, and our lodge openings face to the east in the morning, so we get up with the sun. And our Cree cousins have them to the south, which indicates what time they get up.
This is the I knew being in this territory, this is gonna Thank you. I've been waiting for that.
My question is, how do you explain to me how the shaking Uripi ceremonies used for space travel, time travel? I'm a little confused about that. It's one of our sacred ceremonies, and it seems to me, in my mind, that if you put it in comic book form, it's kind of trivialized. So it's elucidating.
Yeah.
Yes.
You knew you were going to get a diss at some. I get it all the time.
That was great. That was beautiful.
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges, right? What do you put out there? What do you show, and is it appropriate? And I really struggled with that one because it is one of those things like, do you show what this is? And what sort of decided me is, so I'm telling people what it is right now, right? But most people who read this don't know what it is, right? It's sort of like an Easter egg for people who know what it is. I don't name it. I don't talk about what it. I don't explain it in any way. So I think your eyes will slide across it. They won't recognize the form and be, it's sort of one of these things that's not for people who don't know. And I think that it's important that we do these sort of signals that are internal. I mean, you won't even know what it is if you're not from a culture that has that, right? So for example, when I consume, Dene, like Navajo science fiction, they've got all of the symbolism in there that I know, I think I know that it's important to them, but I don't know what it means. And it's not revealing anything to me, but it is deeply meaningful to them because it's within their culture. And I think that we need to build up a sort of a set of illusions, a set of to our sacred stories. The way that Western literature always alludes to the Bible and things like that, things that you only get if you know those stories. And in the work that we do, we start to build those symbols and those references up for our own people. And I'm definitely open to getting smacked down for doing it sometimes, but I also, one of the things I think about is my own kids. The biggest thing that I struggle with them is they never see themselves represented, they never see their culture represented, and so when we put things like that in there, it can be, like, I don't want people to see it as trivial, I want them to see their culture reflected and be like, whoa, I get that, and not everybody else gets that. Because I feel like growing up in the Canadian system, I was experiencing that being an outsider to the literature all the time. People are like, oh yeah, that's a reference to when, I don't know, Jesus did this or that, and I'm like, I don't know that story. I'm the outsider. So yeah, I want that to be there for people who come from that culture to see themselves.
Well, as you can see, we are welcoming questions from the audience. You have a couple professors here at your beck and call, which is rare. Like, that we're literally running. I want to count these steps. I would say that the shake tent my students, with the exception I think 2, would not have known what that was. I told it to them with the understanding that it is a sacred structure and represents an important ceremonial. I'm not Anishinaabe, I'm Maliseet and Mi'kmaq, but I've been in Anishinaabe territory for 20-some years. And so I can read some of the Cree and Anishinaabe, not illusions, allusions. And I have to say, I was also raised Catholic, and I have the advantage then of being able to read all of this Christian symbolism and not having to need anyone to explain it to me. And so I think it does put people on a more equal footing to see their symbols, their stories being represented. Just my opinion.
Hi there. For Chelsea? So I'm also Anishinaabe, and I sort of feel the same way as this gentleman, but if it's a Cree shaved head, sure, because I'm not Cree. But for anyone who's involved with the department, or even for the writers, artists here, I'm having trouble with this concept of what a decolonized person is like. What am I supposed to think of it when I'm decolonized? Like, I'm pretty patriotic about my ancestors and who they were and what they stood for and their culture. But I'm a modern person, and I live in this world made of many nations. And so yeah, I don't even know what this concept of decolonization is. I probably already am decolonized, I think, compared to a lot of people I see, because of the fact that I'm a patriot of my ancestors' country, whereas most natives are still talking about colonial structures and working with them. But anyway, if anyone wants to, can you explain to me in almost like an elevator speech, 20-second, what does it mean to be decolonized?
Okay, this is like one of my favorite questions.
Okay, sorry, and after this, like, you can't talk to me anymore. It's gotta be other people. So what is colonization, right? It's a series of structures. It's institutions. It's not just individual actions, and it's based on really oppressive hierarchy and history, right? You've got the physical occupation of lands. Paired with the transatlantic slave trade, you've got these ruptures and basically these world-ending events in order to claim territory and lands and bodies. And so we all exist with that history, and you cannot exist outside of that history. Like, we can think about what it means to be decolonized by imagining that we are somehow able to undo these violences, and that means undoing these structures. But we can't really imagine what it's like. We can it's like a hazy thing. We're like, well, if we're decolonized, there's not going to be racism. We're not going to define ourselves by like our citizenship or our race or our ethnicity, and we're not going to like divide ourselves up. We're going to be kin. We're going to use Wakutuin to ensure that we understand our relationship to one another, to our non-human kin, to the land. We live there in a way that's sustainable and good. And we have some clues based on what our nations did before, but we can't make it happen right now. We can't make it all happen right now, but we can make some of it happen right now. So some of that might be the work that folks are doing back home with the buffalo treaties, where they're trying to rematriate buffalo, and these are traditional enemies who are working together, Blackfoot, Cree, Dakota, who are bringing buffalo back and trying to see how would that change our relationship to one another in those territories. How would it change the landscape? Because the land has been so transformed. The prairies don't look like anything that our ancestors saw before they were, like, the prairies were actually dug up and changed. So I think of it as like a reclamation of how things used to be, but also going forward, trying to build in ways to ensure that the kinds of oppressions we experience today don't continue. And the only way that we can do that is by constantly talking about what does it mean to be decolonized, and never taking it for granted and not using it in a metaphorical sense. Like, I'm decolonized because I don't drink Coke or Pepsi. No, that's not enough. It's got to be like a really, really deep thing, and no individual can do it. It's got to be something that we do collectively, not just Indigenous people, but all peoples. And that's how I'm totally avoiding answering your question. No. But no, it is, and I can't even imagine what it would be like, because I am colonized. We experience these oppressions, and we want to break out of it, but they form the boundaries of our reality right now. And all I can hope is that, as a future ancestor, the way that I have to experience this world is something that is going to be incomprehensible to our descendants. That's my biggest hope.
I just want to say, me speaking English to you is an exact result of colonization, and you understanding that I'm speaking English to you. So, that's a thing that you are not decolonized from, and neither am I. So, yeah.
Are there any other questions? Questions, anyone?
Just say ditto.
I'm going to ask a question then to the people who are in this place, especially Jen, and maybe Chelsea will give you a break. So Jen, you're on the spot. What do you think about comics being in this university or any institution or schools? Can comics be a decolonizing tool, or is it just part of this larger process? I know some of my students are thinking about the relationship between comics to capital L literature, but then the weird sort of irony of taking a form that's always been kind of underground and unruly and countercultural, and now we're celebrating it through the wonderful UW program and kind of putting it on this pedestal. So we're feeling these contradictions. And I'm wondering what you think about the way that comics are sort of creeping into mainstream culture, but can they still be subversive? Can they still be decolonizing? Like, how do you feel about it as an artist?
I think with the right team of people writing them and drawing them and putting them out there and publishing them and promoting them, like that whole system, I think that they can be a really good tool, but I do think that there's a total place, a valid place for the underground world of comics as well. And I think that they're on par, and they're all valid in my opinion. Like, I have started kind of becoming more knowledgeable about comics, because I don't want to act like I have this lifelong passion for comics. Like, it's something that kind of came to me as an adult, which is weird. But as a kid, all I used to read was Archie comics here and there, very whatever things. But maybe it was because, one, I didn't see myself in them as a woman, and two, I didn't see myself as an Indigenous person or the experiences I had, so I never really cared, And then so when I was approached to do this, because the whole reason why I started writing in the first place, as you said, I started writing when I was very young, and I didn't write for the sake of being published or any of those things. I wrote because I wasn't relating to the curriculum I was being handed. So I wanted to write a book that the kids I was hanging out with could experience, or that could relate to them. Because I was growing up in a very different world than Harry Potter and all those other things I was reading. So, yeah, I think that when it comes to comics, that's just kind of another form of doing that, and putting them into places like a university, I think is, I don't know, I don't even really blink an eye about it, to be honest.
Wait, can you say the question again?
I guess if I'm going to redirect it to you, I want to think about, you use animals as your characters, and I'm thinking about why animals, why not people, but is that a kind of strategy to sort of shake up our ideas of what kind of stories we can tell? The bigger question was, what happens to comics when they come into institutions like the UW? Or you're also an educator, so you're teaching young people to make comics, but you know, on the one hand, we like to think of comics as being really radical and subversive and not, you know, what gets assigned as homework. But I've assigned half the people in this room a lot of comics as homework. So there's a politics to that. I'm just kind of curious about where you would stand on that.
Well, I know for a fact there are a lot of boring comics. And so I can totally understand that it could be just sort of the same as reading another, you know, like not to say that Mice and Men is bad, but I'm going to use that as my example. But you know, and I can totally and especially, I don't think it's bad. I think it's important to be selective of what you choose, especially, and you know, like think about how, you know, maybe the comics that you're choosing are not written all by white cis men. You know, because comics, especially something like zines or something, is exceptionally, you know, LGBT2 spirit sort of thing. Like it's a very queer thing. So, and lots of people feel very safe in that. So I would think that, you know, there are a lot of comics that sort of celebrate that and could be utilized towards more literature. Like the one that I'm thinking of that is, like, I personally think is boring and I wouldn't want to read it again is like the Louis Riel comic. And it's just sort of, it's not very interesting. And like, I'm not trying to rag on it too hard, but I would assume that people do have to read it because it's, you know, it's historical. And that doesn't necessarily mean interesting or well done. Yeah, and it is hard to find good comics. Like, once again, I'm very particular about what I read, and I actually don't even read a lot of comics because I have a hard time reading them. But yeah, I think even one thing we did in Red River was we went to the comic book store and everybody picked out just a comic of something they liked. And lots of people don't even like comics in the class. Like, we were web majors or something. I don't know, I don't do that anymore. But it's just sort of like giving people the chance who even don't like comics to see that there is like such a variety of something that they might like. You know, there's like everything from, you know, stick figure, philosophical, physics comics to, you know, things that are like incredibly detailed. So like there is hope, but I would say, yeah, it does kind of hurt when it's a boring historical thing. If it's fun and fancy, sure, but yeah, I can see where people find it boring. Yeah, that's my answer. I forget the rest of the questions.
Scott, do you want to say anything about comics? Because you work on both educational comics and ones that are clearly, you know, for a young audience to teach stories, but then you also work on other comics. So are you sort of, do you feel that there's room for everything, or do you have these concerns about comics becoming really gentrified, called graphic novels instead of comics and all that kind of stuff?
I think there's a lot of more diversity with comics in the last 20, certainly in the last 20 or so years. And I think the success of books like that Highwar's been doing, because they dipped their toes into graphic novels and now they've done like 20 over the last 10 years or so, and still producing more because now there is a demand for that. There's a niche, and I think while a lot of people still think of comic books as like superheroes, at least in North American comic books, there is a very strong upswell of comics and graphic novels. To me, it's the same thing, it doesn't really matter. That are going into a lot more diverse topics, and I think they can ultimately, they can still be subversive. I find that there's a lot more independent books, and those independent books are getting a lot more exposure than they were before, because sometimes those zines were like really underground, and they still exist sort of thing, but because there's more diversity, there's more of a demand for things that aren't superheroes, the traditional superheroes. They want slice of life, and they want crime, and they want zombies, of course, too, still, and things that aren't superheroes. And they want future stories and past stories and everything. I don't know. I think there is a place for it, and I think it's going to get more diversified. It might sort of feel, I can see that feeling very unfocused, or it might be like so many diverse things that it becomes this sort of nebulous thing, maybe, because before it's like comic books, superheroes, there you go. There's that, and then there's these little nuggets that you might see somewhere that are subversive, whereas now it's comic books, and it's this it could mean a lot of different things. There's movies that come out that you don't realize are graphic novels originally, like Road to Perdition. It's like, oh, I didn't know that was a graphic novel. And I think it's good for it to be, because there was, I mean, comics were sort of passed off as just superheroes, as cheap entertainment, as throwaway. Even when they were the superhero stories, they were still sometimes trying to, with some mixed success, maybe about talking about social justice issues and things like that. So there was always that. I totally lost where I was going with that. Sorry.
It's okay. We have a few minutes left for a couple questions. There's another one in the back. If one of my students doesn't ask a question, they're all failing.
Being colonized, I like to make a buck, so I wonder if any of the Indigenous panelists can talk about Indigenous storytelling as a means of economic development. Is it worthwhile? Are there markets for these comic books? Do any of you drive BMWs? Can I quit my job and speak the dishes?
What kind of cars do you drive? Can you make a living? Is that what you're asking? Can you make a living on comics?
Okay, so, no. Being relatively new to publishing and publishing anything for money, I was like, it's funny because people do assume that you make just a ton of money. You make so little, and you think about something like this, right? Where you have so many different people that work on this. Like you've got the writers, you've got the artists, the line drawers, you got the colorists, you got the letterer, you got the editors. Oh my God, and so many other people that are involved in that. None of us are making royalties from this. They give you a flat rate, and they're like, all right, see ya, because it's like, they gotta pay people. That being said, what do you mean by making a living, right? It depends. Do you want that BMW? My writing is kind of how I support my family, but that requires me to have a job that lets me write. I think there's space out there. I know so many people who are filmmakers who just struggle, for example, to get funds that non-Indigenous filmmakers just sort of are given sometimes. And they make these projects and it's blood, sweat, and tears all the way, and they're eking out a living. But if what you want to do is make a lot of sunyals, you're SOL. But if you want to make something that's going to last beyond yourself, this is the question for every artist: is it worth it, right? And I wouldn't want to do anything else. It's all I'm good at. So.
Yeah, I would say I have three other jobs. So no, no, you don't make me. And I know a lot of other comic artists who are like, no. Thankfully, living in Canada, we have healthcare. But I know of just recently, a comic artist in New York, and he broke his nose and wrist in a bike accident, and he would without crowdsourced funding, he would not be able to he wouldn't have been able to pay for the ambulance. So if it's something you want to do, obviously I would assume most of us create because we enjoy doing it regardless of the monetary benefits, of which there are little. And I'm not trying to discourage you because I truly enjoy what I do, but you will have to probably pick up some extra jobs if you want to do something like this. But you could also, you know, win the lottery, and then you wouldn't have to worry about it. You know.
Anybody else want to chime in on poverty?
As an Indigenous person anyways, but just as an artist, yeah, kind of a ditto thing. Because I work 2 jobs. I am been very fortunate because of, once again, the success of the books with High Water and that is a big part of my living wage, but it's also unfortunately not the only source. So I still have a full-time job. There are, and I feel like with what you're asking with, you know, or you can get the BMW and things like that, I felt like there was a little bit of going back to what the decolonized future looks like, because that's kind of tied into it. A little bit of just maybe not so much getting rich, but just being able to live, and it'd be nice to be able to live comfortably. It'd be nice to be able to live and not break yourself trying to do so, sort of thing. So yeah, like I don't make a ton of money or anything, but I make enough for a living, and I keep doing it because I enjoy it, and I really do enjoy working with the people that I collaborate with. I like working on the stuff on my own when I have the time, which isn't very much these days. But yeah, it's also a matter of re-envisioning how I want to live my life, how I want the future to be sort of shaped. Do I want to live in a world where I'm a little bit more in balance with things, people around me, or in balance with nature, things like that. So it's not important to me to have those designer clothes or that new car. I get a used one. I like thrift shopping, just like Macklemore. And or, you know, going back to like the grunge era, which was also very thrifty. And those are the things that are important to me, and not all the other consumerism things. But that's the game that I have to play to get by.
Are there any more questions? No pressure. Anyone?
You're only going to fail if you don't.
All right, one student, so they all pass.
I have a question for the artists. Can you talk about the differences of working with digital and traditional media? Because I'm planning on getting started on this creative project, and I'm wondering which one I should do, and like what are the pros and cons of each? Yeah.
Excellent question. Who wants to go first?
Well, okay. First of all, definitely I would go with what you're more comfortable with. Like I primarily at this point in my life work digitally because it is easier and I can undo things so much. Personally, I would say if you want to do art creatively, probably digitally is the smartest way to go. There are a lot of tablets, like drawing tablets you can get for real cheap. I used to use the mouse on my computer to draw. So obviously, and the other thing is traditional art, like you can get all your supplies and stuff, and you can have the nicest supplies, but it doesn't really matter. Like I could probably whip something out with Crayola markers pretty good. Yeah, I would say do what feels comfortable and within your budget as well, because obviously, not everybody has money to drop on tablets and whatever. I don't even know, like they might have them for rent here. I have no idea maybe, I don't know, maybe. Yeah, I would just say what you're comfortable with and what's affordable, like honest, and what's doable. But if you want to do digital art, I would say start small. You can always get like fancier, bigger tablets in the future.
Go, pass it down.
Ditto. But yeah, what's more comfortable? Like I grew up very analog, so that's why I still draw pen to paper. That's why I grew up with when I went to university, and this would have been late 90s. Like there was like Photoshop, and I did kind of dip my toes a little bit into the graphic design program, but I focused more on the illustration program and making comic books, but I made comic books by hand. That's what I was more concerned about. I even did the lettering by hand. God, it looked awful. That being said, I have been slowly transitioning more and more into using digital stuff, but I still currently like to draw. Part of it's because I don't know about investing into the technology to have like a tablet and being comfortable with that, because it took me a while to get used to even using the stylus and looking at the screen here, my hand being over here doing stuff. So for a while when I was coloring comic books for comic companies, I was using the mouse, and I drove my boss and other people crazy using the mouse trying to trace and color and comic books, and that eventually got out of that, but it took a while. But there's a lot of advantages to the digital. You don't have to have things printed. You don't need to buy a lot of art supplies. Like that tablet might be a big cost now, but like I have to buy pens every few months. And then of course there's the ecological aspect if I want to keep myself awake at night. So my way probably is, in the end, probably a little bit more expensive down the road certainly than working digitally. But again, you've got to be comfortable. So I wasn't comfortable 20 plus years ago. Now I'm sort of getting more comfortable, but I just don't want to shell out the money where I can, because I'm thrift shopping.
Any final comments?
I will make some final thank yous, and then we can maybe, if you want to say hi to the artists, and please do pick up on our table over there flyers for our future One Book UW events. But before we leave, I do need to take a minute to thank our sponsors and supporters. So once again, this evening's panel is sponsored by the H. Sanford Riley Fellowship in Canadian History, and we're also grateful for the support of the library, especially Brett Lahi, sitting right there, acting dean of the library, as well as Josh Herder, the Assessment and Communications Librarian, and Michael Dudley, Community Outreach Librarian, who organized the Indigenous Comics Geek Out that ran this afternoon. I hope some of you checked that out. I want to thank Media Services for providing the technology setup tonight and for helping us arrange for video recording of the event. Again, Brandon Christopher over there on the camera. We hope to have the video of tonight's panel posted to our website within a couple of weeks, so please check there and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for announcements and some recaps of tonight. I'd also like to thank Dr. Nigan Sinclair from the University of Manitoba for helping us get Chelsea Vowel onto the panel tonight and for doing the coffee run for Chelsea and others earlier. And Jennifer Gibson, who I saw over there but might have had to leave, Director and Curator of Gallery 1CO3 for her partnership with One Book UW. If you haven't already, we highly recommend you go downstairs to the gallery and see the exhibit When Raven Became Spider, which is on to the end of November, and there's a link on our own website. Finally, of course, I want to thank our speakers, Scott B. Henderson, Jennifer Storm, Alice R.L., Chelsea Vowel, and our moderator, Julie Pelletier, for a just fabulous discussion, and all of you for coming out tonight. And I will plug that next Tuesday from 2:30 to 3:45, we have Katerina Vermette coming in to talk about the first chapter in this place on Annie Valentine, and that's in the Leatherdale Commons, where you can sort of squeeze next to each other and fit in there. We have a book club with Greg Kamichak, who did your favorite chapter there, Alice. You can come and heckle him, maybe. And that's on November 28th at 12. And then we have a special guest, a kind of late addition that we're super excited about. Not an artist in this place, but an emerging Indigenous artist from Vancouver, Cole Pauls, and his book, Dapukata Warriors, has just come out. It's a collection of zines that are now collected into a book, and we have an exhibit from his book downstairs on the wall across from Gallery 1CO3. He's coming for a book launch and to give a talk on language revival comics, and his own book is a bilingual book, so he's interested in working with elders to publish bilingual comics. And so he's coming on November 27th? 6?
28.
28, thank you. It's late. And that's a morning talk, 10:30 to 11:30, also in Leatherdale Commons. And he works a lot with young people, so if you're a teacher or you work with young people and you can bring them, that would be great. It is a talk that will be suitable for all ages. So So please think about those events. Finally, we're having a symposium, and we need you to submit ideas for presentations and panels. They don't have to be super long. You can come with your friends who have read this place and talk for 5 or 10 minutes about your response. Or if you're a student in a class writing a paper or a response piece, please submit that. There's information over there about how to submit, and it's also on our website under Get Involved. And we have prizes at the end of this program for essays and artwork in response to this place and on Indigenous comics more generally. So there are lots of ways to get involved, and please do. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you to our panelists.